Maria Santos had been in Iraq for 8 months when everything changed. The 8-year-old Army medic from Phoenix, Arizona, never imagined she would face her darkest hour in the dusty streets of Fallujah. She had joined the military to serve her country and help save lives, following in her father's footsteps, who had served in Vietnam. Her unit was part of a humanitarian mission, providing medical aid to local civilians caught in the crossfire of ongoing conflict. The morning of November 15th started like any other. Maria woke up in the makeshift medical tent at 0500 hours. The desert sun, already painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She had spent most of the previous night treating wounded soldiers and civilians. Her hands still stained with antiseptic, and her uniform wrinkled from exhaustion. Despite the constant danger, Maria found purpose in her work. Every life she saved meant everything to her. Her unit consisted of 12 medical personnel and 24 security escorts. They were stationed at a temporary forward operating base, set up in an abandoned school building on the outskirts of Fallujah. The building had thick concrete walls and provided good cover. But everyone knew that nowhere was truly safe in this war-torn city. The sound of distant explosions and gunfire had become as familiar as breathing. Captain James Mitchell, their commanding officer, called for the morning briefing at 0600 hours. Maria grabbed her coffee, the bitter taste barely keeping her alert after another sleepless night. The briefing room was actually just a cleared classroom, with a few folding chairs and a whiteboard covered in tactical maps and security updates. Intelligence reports increased insurgent activity in Sector 7, Captain Mitchell announced, pointing to a section of the map marked in red. We've got 3 medical calls today, 2 routine checkups at the refugee camp, and 1 emergency call from a family trapped in a building after yesterday's bombing. Maria listened intently, taking notes in her weathered notebook. She had learned to pay attention to every detail, as the smallest piece of information could mean the difference between life and death. The emergency call particularly concerned her because it involved children, and she had made it her personal mission to ensure no child suffered unnecessarily under her watch. The first 2 calls went smoothly. Maria and her team treated minor injuries and distributed medical supplies to families who had lost everything. The gratitude in their eyes reminded her why she had chosen this dangerous assignment. Children smiled at her despite their circumstances, and elderly men blessed her in Arabic, their hands pressed to their hearts in gestures of thanks. It was during the 3rd call that everything went wrong. The family they were supposed to help lived in a partially collapsed apartment building in one of Fallujah's most dangerous neighborhoods. Intelligence had cleared the area, but Maria felt uneasy as their convoy of 3 armored vehicles moved through the narrow streets. The buildings around them showed the scars of war. Bullet holes, peppered concrete walls, and debris from previous explosions littered the roads. Local residents had long since fled, leaving behind a ghost town atmosphere that made every shadow seem threatening. Maria checked her medical supplies one more time, ensuring she had everything needed for whatever they might encounter. Their convoy stopped in front of the damaged building at 1430 hours. The structure leaned dangerously to one side, its upper floors partially collapsed. Maria could see why the family hadn't been able to leave on their own. Getting to the 3rd floor where they were trapped would require careful navigation through unstable debris. Sergeant Rodriguez, their security chief, deployed his men in defensive positions around the building. "Stay alert," he radioed to his team. "This place gives me a bad feeling." Maria appreciated his caution, but her medical training overrode any personal fears. There were injured people inside who needed her help. She entered the building with 2 other medics, Corporal Johnson and Private Williams, both experienced soldiers she trusted completely. Their footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell as they climbed toward the 3rd floor, their equipment bags heavy on their shoulders. The smell of dust and decay filled the air, mixed with something else Maria couldn't identify. They found the family huddled in what used to be a bedroom. An elderly man sat beside his unconscious wife, while 2 young children clung to each other in the corner. The woman had been struck by falling debris and appeared to have internal injuries. Maria immediately went to work, checking vital signs and setting up an IV line while her colleagues prepared the stretcher. The evacuation process was slow and careful. They had to navigate the woman down 3 flights of damaged stairs, while maintaining her IV and monitoring her condition. The elderly man insisted on carrying one child, while Private Williams helped with the other. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. They had just reached the ground floor when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the concrete wall inches from Maria's head, sending fragments flying. "Sniper!" Sergeant Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio. "Take cover immediately." Maria's training kicked in instantly. She pushed the stretcher behind a concrete pillar, while her colleagues rushed the family to safety. More shots followed, the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing through the abandoned building. She could hear Rodriguez, coordinating with his men, trying to locate the shooter's position. "We need to move now," Corporal Johnson shouted over the gunfire. Maria nodded, knowing they had to get the injured woman to the vehicles before it was too late. They began moving toward the exit, using the building's walls for cover. The attack intensified as they approached the doorway. Maria realized they were facing multiple shooters positioned in buildings across the street. Muzzle flashes appeared in different windows, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped them inside. The sound of bullets striking concrete became constant, like deadly rain against the walls. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio again, strained with urgency. "Multiple contacts. We're taking heavy fire from at least 3 positions. Need immediate backup." Maria knew that backup could be 20 minutes away, and they didn't have 20 minutes. She made a decision that would haunt her forever. Seeing that the unconscious woman was losing too much blood, Maria decided to make a run for the medical vehicle, parked 30 meters away. She had treated hundreds of patients and saved countless lives, but she had never abandoned someone who needed her help. "Cover me," she told Johnson as she prepared to move. "I'm going for the vehicle. We can treat her properly once we get there." Johnson nodded grimly, understanding the risk but knowing they had no choice. Maria took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway. The late afternoon sun blinded her momentarily as she moved from the building's shadow into the bright street. She could see the armored medical vehicle, its back doors open and ready to receive patients. 30 meters had never seemed so far. She made it 15 meters before the first bullet found her. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer, spinning her around and sending her medical bag flying. She staggered but kept moving, driven by pure determination and the knowledge that stopping meant death. The second bullet caught her in the shoulder, then the third in her leg. Maria fell to her knees in the middle of the street, exposed and vulnerable. She could hear her teammates shouting her name, but their voices seemed distant and unreal. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. More bullets followed in rapid succession. Maria lost count after the 7th impact, her body jerking with each strike. She collapsed face down on the hot asphalt, feeling her strength drain away with each heartbeat. The sound of gunfire continued around her, but it seemed muffled now, as if coming from underwater. Through the pain and growing darkness, Maria could still hear the crying of the children she had tried to save. That sound kept her conscious when everything else told her to let go. She pressed her hand against the largest wound in her abdomen, feeling the warm blood seeping between her fingers. Sergeant Rodriguez and his men returned fire, trying to suppress the shooters long enough to reach Maria. But every time they moved toward her position, the gunfire intensified, forcing them back behind cover. Maria lay motionless in the street, knowing that any rescue attempt would likely result in more casualties. The attack continued for another 20 minutes before enemy fire finally began to diminish. When backup arrived, the shooters had melted away into the maze of Fallujah's streets, leaving behind only the echoes of violence and a young medic bleeding out on the asphalt. Maria felt herself losing consciousness as Boots approached her position. She tried to speak, to tell them about the woman still inside who needed medical attention, but no words came. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the concerned face of Corporal Johnson, his lips moving in words she could no longer hear. The attack had lasted 37 minutes. When it was over, 11 bullet wounds marked Maria's body, and her team believed she was dead. They had no way of knowing that somewhere deep inside, Maria Santos was fighting a battle more fierce than any firefight in the streets of Fallujah. The silence that followed the gunfire was more terrifying than the attack itself. Maria Santos lay motionless on the hot asphalt of the Fallujah street, her body riddled with 11 bullet wounds, her blood forming dark pools beneath her. To anyone watching, she appeared dead. Even Corporal Johnson, her closest friend and fellow medic, checked for a pulse twice before shaking his head grimly. The evacuation was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Maria's team had been trained for situations like this, though none of them had ever imagined they would be recovering their own. Sergeant Rodriguez coordinated the withdrawal while his men provided security, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding buildings for any sign of renewed enemy activity. Johnson knelt beside Maria one final time, his hands shaking as he checked for any sign of life. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, her breathing so shallow it was imperceptible. Blood had soaked through her uniform, and the multiple wounds painted a grim picture that left little room for hope. Protocol demanded they recover all personnel, living or dead, but with enemy forces still in the area and more casualties mounting, difficult decisions had to be made. "We have to go," Rodriguez called out, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "Charlie Company is taking fire 2 blocks east, and we're needed there now." Johnson looked at Maria one last time, then carefully placed his own medical tags beside her body. It was a battlefield tradition, a way of marking the fallen until proper recovery could be arranged. The convoy departed at 1,547 hours, leaving Maria alone in the abandoned street. The sound of diesel engines faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie quiet that seemed to blanket Fallujah during the hottest part of the day. Dust swirled around her motionless form, carried by the desert wind that had witnessed too much violence in this ancient city. But Maria Santos was not dead. Deep within her broken body, something extraordinary was happening. Her mind, trained by years of medical education and battlefield experience, had retreated to a place beyond consciousness, but not beyond awareness. She could not move, could barely breathe, but some part of her remained stubbornly alive. The first sensation that penetrated the darkness was thirst. Her mouth felt like it had been filled with sand, and her throat burned with every barely perceptible breath. Hours passed before she managed to open her eyes, and when she did, the world appeared as a hazy blur of shapes and shadows. The sun had moved across the sky, telling her that significant time had elapsed. Though she had no way of knowing exactly how long, moving was impossible. The bullets had shattered bones and torn through muscle, leaving her body a collection of separate agonies that threatened to drag her back into unconsciousness with every small movement. But Maria had not survived this long by giving up easily. Her father had taught her that Santos women were made of tougher stuff than most people realized. Night fell over Fallujah like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a different kind of danger. The city came alive after dark, with sounds that chilled the blood of even experienced soldiers. Distant explosions, the rattle of automatic weapons, and the occasional scream carried on the wind painted an audio landscape of ongoing warfare. Maria lay in the middle of it all, invisible to the world but acutely aware of her vulnerability. Thirst became her primary tormentor. She had lost significant amounts of blood, and dehydration was setting in rapidly. Every medical textbook she had studied told her that she should have died hours ago, but textbooks had not accounted for Maria's stubborn refusal to surrender. She began to focus on small goals. Breathe in, breathe out, stay conscious for 1 more minute. The second night brought new challenges. Her wounds, while not bleeding as heavily as before, had begun to attract insects drawn by the smell of blood and exposed tissue. Maria felt them crawling across her skin but lacked the strength to brush them away. She learned to endure sensations that would have driven her mad under normal circumstances. Memory became her refuge. She thought about her childhood in Phoenix, where summer temperatures had prepared her for the brutal heat of the Iraqi desert. She remembered her father teaching her to change the oil in their old pickup truck, his patient voice explaining that mechanical things could be fixed if you understood how they worked. The human body is just another machine. Mija, he had told her when she announced her intention to study medicine. Learn how it works, and you can fix almost anything. By the third day, Maria had managed to move her right hand slightly. The motion sent waves of agony through her body, but it represented progress. She was fighting her way back from the edge of death, one small victory at a time. The bullet wound in her abdomen, which should have been fatal, had somehow missed her vital organs by millimeters. Her medical training told her that such survival was statistically impossible. But statistics had never accounted for the power of human determination. Water became an obsession. She could see puddles from a recent rain shower just a few meters away, but they might as well have been on another planet for all the good they did her. Maria began to plan how she might reach them, though even the smallest movement still seemed impossible. Planning gave her mind something to focus on besides the pain. The sounds of the city continued around her. Occasionally, vehicles would pass on nearby streets, their engines growing louder, then fading into the distance. Maria tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She realized that even if someone found her, they would likely assume she was dead and move on. She needed to find a way to signal that she was alive. On the fourth day, Maria achieved another small victory. She managed to lift her head slightly and look around her immediate surroundings. The effort exhausted her completely, but she had gained valuable information about her situation. She was lying in what appeared to be a residential street, with damaged buildings on both sides. Debris from various explosions had been scattered around the area, suggesting that this part of the city saw regular combat. More importantly, she could see that her medical bag had landed about 3 meters away when she was first shot. If she could somehow reach it, the supplies inside might help her treat her own wounds and improve her chances of survival. The bag contained morphine for pain, antibiotics to prevent infection, and bandages to control bleeding. Most crucially, it contained water purification tablets and a small emergency water supply. The journey to her medical bag became Maria's Mount Everest. 3 meters of broken asphalt stretched before her like an impossible distance. She began by moving individual fingers, then her hand, then her entire arm. Each movement was carefully planned and executed, with long rest periods between efforts. The process was excruciating, but Maria had learned to break down impossible tasks into manageable pieces. By the evening of the fourth day, she had managed to move almost a full meter. Her body left a trail of blood on the asphalt, but the bleeding had mostly stopped, indicating that her wounds were beginning to heal despite the lack of medical attention. Maria's medical knowledge told her that she was experiencing something extraordinary, though she was too focused on survival to fully appreciate the miracle of her recovery. The nights were the hardest times. The temperature would drop dramatically, leaving Maria shivering uncontrollably despite the desert heat of the day. Her body had no reserves left to maintain normal temperature, and hypothermia became as real a threat as blood loss or infection. She learned to curl into a tight ball to conserve heat, though every movement still brought waves of pain. Communication with the outside world seemed impossible until Maria remembered the emergency flare in her vest pocket. Standard military issue included a single-use flare for emergency signaling, though reaching it would require another Herculean effort. The flare represented hope, a way to alert any friendly forces in the area that someone was alive and in need of rescue. By the dawn of the fifth day, Maria had reached her medical bag. The moment her fingers closed around the familiar canvas material, she felt a surge of hope stronger than any painkiller. Inside the bag were the tools of her trade, instruments she had used to save countless lives. Now they might save her own. The water came first. Maria's hands shook as she opened a small bottle of sterile water, spilling half of it in her eagerness to drink. The liquid felt like pure life flowing down her parched throat. She forced herself to drink slowly, knowing that her damaged stomach might not be able to handle too much at once. Next came the morphine. Maria had resisted using painkillers until now, afraid that they would cloud her judgment and reduce her chances of survival. But with medical supplies finally available, she could afford to take the edge off the constant agony that had been her companion for days. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. Maria used her remaining strength to inject herself with antibiotics and apply pressure bandages to her worst wounds. Her medical training guided her hands even in her weakened state, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought became too difficult. She was treating herself with the same skill and care she had shown to hundreds of other patients. As the fifth night approached, Maria felt something she had not experienced since the attack began. Genuine hope for survival. She had water, medical supplies, and most importantly, she had proven to herself that she was stronger than anyone had ever imagined. The girl from Phoenix who had joined the army to help others had discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. But survival was only the first challenge. Maria was still alone in one of the most dangerous cities in the world, unable to walk, and with no way to contact friendly forces. Her fight for life was far from over, and the most difficult tests still lay ahead. The sixth day dawned with a peculiar stillness that made Maria Santos nervous. After 5 days, lying wounded in the streets of Fallujah, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of warfare that echoed through the city. The absence of gunfire and explosions felt ominous rather than peaceful, like the calm before a devastating storm. Maria had spent the night conserving her strength and planning her next move. The medical supplies from her bag had stabilized her condition somewhat, but she knew that infection and dehydration would eventually kill her if rescue did not come soon. Her wounds were showing signs of healing, which her medical training told her was remarkable given the circumstances. But she was still far from mobile. The emergency flare remained her best hope for signaling friendly forces, but using it required careful timing. Fire it too early, and it might be seen by enemy fighters who would finish what their comrades had started. Wait too long, and she might miss her only chance at rescue. Maria had to judge when coalition forces were likely to be operating in her area. Around midday, she heard something that made her heart race with hope. The distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the southeast reached her ears, growing steadily louder. Maria recognized the deep thrum of military rotorcraft, possibly American Blackhawks conducting a patrol or transport mission. This might be her only opportunity. Fighting through the pain, Maria managed to reach into her tactical vest and extract the flare. Her hands trembled with weakness and anticipation as she pulled the activation cord. The flare burst to life with a brilliant red glow, casting long shadows across the abandoned street. She held it as high as her injured arm would allow, waving it slowly back and forth to maximize its visibility. The helicopters passed overhead without stopping. Maria's heart sank as she watched them disappear into the distance, their sound fading until only silence remained. She had gambled her one signaling device on a chance that had not paid off. Despair threatened to overwhelm her, but Maria had not survived this long by surrendering to negative emotions. What she did not know was that the helicopter crew had indeed spotted her flare. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, door gunner on the lead Blackhawk, had been scanning the ground below when the red signal caught his attention. He immediately reported the sighting to his aircraft commander, who made note of the coordinates for follow-up investigation. The helicopter crew faced the same problem that had plagued Maria's original unit. The area where the flare had been spotted was known to be heavily contested, with enemy fighters using abandoned buildings as firing positions. Any rescue attempt would require significant planning and resources that were currently committed to other urgent operations across the city. But Torres could not forget what he had seen. During the evening briefing back at their forward operating base, he approached Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, the SEAL team commander who was coordinating special operations in the Fallujah sector. Hayes listened carefully as Torres described the flare sighting and provided the exact coordinates. "That's in the middle of bandit country," Hayes observed, studying the tactical map. "Intel says that whole area is crawling with insurgents. Could be a trap." She paused, considering the implications. "But if someone is alive out there and asking for help, we have an obligation to respond." Hayes was not the kind of officer who made decisions lightly. The 3-4-year-old from Montana had earned her position through years of exemplary service and a reputation for bringing her people home safely. She had lost friends in Iraq and Afghanistan, and each decision potentially put more lives at risk. But the military code was clear. No one gets left behind. The SEAL team spent the evening planning a reconnaissance mission to investigate the flare sighting. Hayes selected her most experienced operators for the job, knowing that they would be moving through some of the most dangerous territory in Iraq. The mission would launch before dawn to take advantage of reduced enemy activity and better concealment. Maria spent her 6th night fighting off fever and hallucinations brought on by infection and dehydration. She dreamed of her childhood home in Phoenix, of her father teaching her to be strong, and of the patients she had treated during her deployment. In her delirium, she held conversations with people who were not there, including fallen comrades who urged her to keep fighting. She woke to the sound of distant gunfire and realized that another day was beginning. Her water supply was almost exhausted, and the antibiotics were only slowing the inevitable progression of infection in her wounds. Maria knew that she probably had less than 24 hours before her condition became critical. The thought motivated her to attempt something she had been considering since reaching her medical bag. Using torn strips from her uniform and debris from the street, Maria began constructing a more permanent signal that might attract attention even when she was unconscious. She arranged white bandages in the shape of an arrow pointing toward her location, weighted down with chunks of concrete to prevent the wind from disturbing them. The work exhausted her completely, but it gave her something productive to focus on besides the pain. The SEAL reconnaissance team launched their mission at 0400 hours on the 7th day. 6 operators moved through the pre-dawn darkness of Fallujah with practiced stealth, their night vision equipment turning the abandoned city into a green-tinted landscape of shadows and potential threats. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes led the team personally, something she rarely did but felt was necessary given the circumstances. They approached Maria's location from multiple directions, establishing overwatch positions in surrounding buildings before anyone moved into the open street. Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, the team's medic, was the first to spot the makeshift signal Maria had constructed. Through his scope, he could see what appeared to be a human form lying motionless beside the arrow of white cloth. "Possible casualty spotted," Morrison whispered into his radio. "Grid coordinates match the flare sighting. Subject appears to be down." Hayes acknowledged the report and moved her team into position for a closer look. Every instinct told her this could be an elaborate trap, but something about the scene suggested genuine desperation rather than enemy deception. Morrison approached Maria's position with extreme caution, his rifle ready and his eyes constantly scanning for threats. When he was close enough to see clearly, he stopped in shock. The figure lying in the street was obviously American military personnel, and obviously still alive. He could see the slight rise and fall of breathing, though it was barely perceptible. "Holy shit," Morrison breathed into his radio. "We've got a live American down here. Female, multiple gunshot wounds, appears to have been here for several days." Hayes felt her heart race as she processed this information. Someone had been lying wounded in enemy territory for almost a week and was somehow still alive. The extraction had to be swift and professional. Morrison immediately began assessing Maria's condition, while his teammates provided security. Her pulse was weak, but steady, and her breathing, though shallow, was regular. The bullet wounds showed signs of self-treatment, indicating that she had been conscious and coherent enough to provide her own medical care. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Morrison asked quietly. Maria's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on his face. She tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper. Morrison leaned closer to hear her words. "Maria Santos, Army medic," she managed to say. "Been here 6 days." The simple statement conveyed more courage and determination than any Medal of Honor citation Morrison had ever read. This woman had been left for dead and had refused to die, surviving through sheer force of will in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Hayes coordinated the evacuation with practiced efficiency. The team had brought a lightweight stretcher specifically for casualty recovery, and Morrison quickly established an IV line to begin addressing Maria's dehydration. The movement caused her obvious pain, but Maria bit back any sounds that might compromise the team's stealth. The journey back to the extraction point took 45 minutes of careful movement through hostile territory. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness during the trip, but each time she woke, she was reassured by the professional competence of her rescuers. These were not just soldiers. They were the elite of the military. And she was in the best possible hands. The helicopter that lifted Maria out of Fallujah was the same one from which Torres had spotted her flare. As they gained altitude, and the dangerous city fell away below them, Maria managed to catch the door gunner's attention. "Thank you," she mouthed, though her voice was too weak to be heard over the engine noise. Torres nodded and gave her a thumbs up, both of them understanding the significance of the moment. Maria was evacuated first to a combat support hospital in Baghdad, then to a military medical facility in Germany, and finally to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. The full extent of her injuries amazed the medical teams who treated her. 11 bullet wounds, several requiring multiple surgeries to repair. Yet she had survived 6 days in a combat zone with minimal medical intervention. The story of Maria Santos spread quickly through military channels and eventually reached the media. She became a symbol of courage, determination, and the warrior spirit that defined the best of America's armed forces. But for Maria herself, the real victory was not the medals or recognition that followed. It was the simple fact that she had proven to herself that giving up was never an option. 6 months later, after extensive rehabilitation and recovery, Maria returned to active duty. She requested assignment to another combat medical unit, surprising those who expected her traumatic experience to end her military career. When asked why she wanted to return to such dangerous work, her answer was simple and direct. "There are still people out there who need help," she said, "and I'm not done helping them yet." The girl from Phoenix, who had been left for dead in Fallujah, had discovered that survival was not about avoiding death, but about finding reasons to keep living. Her story became proof that the human spirit, when tested by impossible circumstances, could achieve miracles that defied all reasonable expectation.